I assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Free and uncorrupted communication.
My name is Melvin Oliver, and I'm the Dean of the Division of Social Sciences here at UCSB, and I want to welcome you to the third Division of Social Sciences Public Policy Briefing. These events are designed to bring to public attention the exciting interdisciplinary scholarship in the social sciences at UCSB that addresses contemporary public policy issues. Today we will hear from the author of Politics, Persuasion, and Educational Testing, UCSB Professor of Political Science, Lorraine McDonnell. Commenting on her book will be Richard Duran, Professor of Education at the Gewurz Graduate School of Education, and Robert Noel, Professor Emeritus of Political Science here at UCSB and a current member of the Santa Barbara School District. The Social Science Public Policy Briefing is really designed to highlight the wide-ranging work that is done in the social sciences at UCSB that has public policy significance. The division is strongly committed to interdisciplinary scholarship that informs public understanding, energizes public conversation, and helps formulate and implement progressive public policy. Our research is characterized by its broad-ranging approach to public policy that does not focus purely on narrow cost-benefit analyses, but includes scholarship based on multiple methods and diverse theoretical perspectives, with an emphasis on race, gender, and when appropriate, the global dimensions of issues. Our work contextualizes public policy in a way that enriches our understanding by bringing to the fore the multifaceted dimensions of public issues. The division as a whole is committed to scholarship that addresses public policy in three ways. First, we are deliberate in bringing new data to the attention of interested publics and policymakers. Second, we provide critical perspectives on the many social, political, and economic issues that the public struggles to understand. And finally, we provide the public with alternative visions of how to organize social life, social organizations, society, and other structures. This public policy briefing is one of the ways that we can bring new data, critical perspectives, and alternative visions to the public policy arena. We have been doing 2 or 3 of these each year, and depending on when publications appear, we time them accordingly. Today we're fortunate to highlight the work of Professor Lorraine McDonnell. Let me tell you a little bit about Professor McDonnell. She received her BA in Political Science from UC Berkeley and her MA and PhD from Stanford University. She came to UCSB in 1991 from her 16-year post as a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica, a policy think tank that helps improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis. Professor McDonnell is one of the top experts in the country on educational policy and the author of numerous books and papers, including The Politics of Education, Influencing Policy and Beyond, No Child Left Behind and the Federal Role in Education, Evolution or Revolution, and Accountability as Seen Through a Political Lens. Her book, Politics, Persuasion, and Educational Testing, provides the most in-depth analysis on the politics over what should be taught and tested. And her book is particularly timely as school districts across the country struggle to move to high-stakes testing in order to comply with the No Child Left Behind Act. Lorraine will speak for approximately 40 minutes, and she'll be followed by comments from Professor Richard Duran and Bob Noel. After that, we'll take questions and have some discussion. Let me essentially introduce our other two panelists so we can move straight through the program. Professor Duran received his PhD in psychology from the University of California, Berkeley, and joined the Gewurz Graduate School of Education here at UCSB as a faculty member in 1984. His specialty areas include assessment and education policy and educational interventions serving English language learners. He's the author of several recent pieces of work that address the implementation of No Child Left Behind, educating at-risk students, and English language learners. Bob Noel is a professor emeritus of political science here at UCSB. He received his PhD from Northwestern in 1962 in political science with an emphasis in international relations. And he began his career at UCSB in 1963 and retired over 20 years later in 1984. He joined the Santa Barbara School District Board of Education in 1998 and is currently serving on the board. We're pleased to have all of these distinguished scholars and commentators, and without further ado, let me turn it over to Lorraine.
For those of us of a certain age, tests were typically something that our teachers made up and gave us every few weeks. We knew that if we paid attention in class, we did our homework, we'd probably do all right on them. Standardized tests that came from outside our school were very rare. Maybe once a year we would take one of these tests, but we knew there were no consequences. Our parents probably didn't even get the score reports. And except for the SAT that was looming large, for those of us who were planning to go to college, we really didn't deal with standardized tests. And even some of you out there who are younger, you may remember taking standardized tests, and the score for your school would be reported in the local newspaper. But they were essentially what testing experts call low-stakes tests, because there were no consequences for you or for your school. But times have changed. Standardized tests that are imposed on schools by the federal and state government are now high stakes. Under the federal No Child Left Behind Act, students in grades 3 through 8 must be tested each year, and sanctions can be imposed on schools if they don't make progress quickly enough. Beginning this year, students in California are required to pass the California high school exit exam, or they won't receive a diploma, although that may change after today, and a court decision. So testing plays a very different role than it did back when we older folks were in school. What I'd like to do today is draw on my training as a political scientist and examine the current state of student assessment through an explicitly political lens. Although I'm going to touch on the educational dimensions of testing, I'm going to focus on two major policy goals that elected officials have pursued in using student assessment as their main strategy. And I'm also going to talk about the kinds of political interests that have emerged around testing. For most of my talk, I'm going to discuss a goal of assessment policy that's in the spotlight less these days, but I think is no less important. And that's the use of student assessment to promote curricular values. The second goal that I'll discuss more briefly is the one that we typically associate with assessment policy, and that's its role as an accountability mechanism. The major argument that I'm going to be making is that student testing is one of the most effective strategies available to federal and state policymakers to change teaching and learning. In fact, I would argue that testing experts, along with reformers who advocated using curriculum standards and student testing as a way to change elementary and secondary education, have handed policymakers probably a far more powerful tool than they ever imagined. It's not just that student assessments are a seemingly inexpensive reform, at least for those at the top of the system who are initiating the policy, or that these test results are now being routinely used to allocate valuable things like financial resources and diplomas, but it's also the case that student testing is one of the most efficient effective ways to instill curricular values in classrooms if those values are broadly accepted by educators, parents, and the public, and if those responsible for implementing curricular standards have the resources to do it well. The policy implications that I'm going to be discussing relate to the conditions needed to make this very powerful strategy work as intended without producing perverse unintended consequences. Now, in my talk, I'm going to be relying on research that I did comparing state assessments in California, Kentucky, and North Carolina in the 1990s, and also on some subsequent articles and chapters that I wrote since the publication of the book that Dean Oliver mentioned. That book was based on interviews with a little over 300 state policymakers, educators, and parents in the 3 states. It also, I coded and analyzed teachers' assignments for about 24 teachers in Kentucky, about 24 in North Carolina, to see the extent to which their teaching was similar to the state assessment. Now, to some extent, the data on which I'm basing my presentation represent a snapshot of 3 states at a particular time. This was when student assessments were lower stakes than they are now under NCLB, and when the focus of political mobilization was around the curricular values that were in those tests rather than in how tests were being used. Yet I do believe that the history of student testing in the 1990s does hold lessons for its use now. And the current high-stakes use of assessments that we're seeing, I think, reinforces the conclusion that standardized tests represent a powerful tool that policymakers can use to advance political solutions to educational problems. Now let me talk first then about assessment policy as a strategy to promote curricular values. And you do have some overheads that begin to summarize some of the things I'm going to be saying. There are 3 reasons why student assessment policy came to be used as a strategy to promote curricular values. The first was simply a recognition on the part of federal and state and even local policymakers that they really had limited influence over what actually happened in classrooms. There had been a history of different kinds of state and federal mandates, different kinds of the carrot of different kinds of grants, but they're really having a marginal effect on how teachers teach. So it became clear that testing was likely to be the most powerful tool available. And the potential for testing to change what teachers teach and how they teach it was noted more than 20 years ago in an interview that I had with Bill Honig, who was then the state superintendent of public instruction. And as some of you may remember, Honig had a very clear idea of the kinds of knowledge and skills he wanted teachers to teach and students to learn, but he lacked the authority to implement that vision. In his mind, the solution was simple. I can't mandate a curriculum, he said, but I can test on it. And he wasn't alone in seeing testing as a vehicle for classroom change. In the other states I studied, legislators and state education agency officials believed that a test reflecting the state curricular standards was the most effective way to get those standards into the classrooms, even arguing, as one Kentucky legislator did, that if you have a test of such importance, it will drive the curriculum. Now, at first glance, this belief appears to be the seemingly simplistic notion that if you test it, they will teach it, or teaching to the test is fine as long as it's a good test. But there was more behind policymakers' beliefs about testing as a vehicle of curricular reform, and this brings me to the second reason why assessment came to serve this purpose. Beginning in the, I would say, mid to late 1980s, a variety of academics and others who were interested in reforming public education advanced 2 ideas. And these 2 ideas appealed to policymakers as a way to get greater leverage over what happened in classrooms. The first focused on a strategy that would both equalize learning opportunities and also bring some kind of coherence to the policy system. It was embodied in what became known as the standards movement or standards-based reform. That movement is premised on the idea that educational quality can be improved by setting high academic content standards that apply to all students. So you've heard the phrase, all students can learn to high standards. It was assumed that these standards would define the knowledge and the skills that teachers would teach and students would learn. Then there would be performance standards that would specify what constituted mastery on these content standards. And then teachers and students would be expected to teach and to learn to these, and then they would be tested on it. Implicit in this idea was a set of assumptions. First of all, that educators and the public could agree on a set of curricular values, that these values could be translated into standards, instruction could be delivered based on the standards, and that there could be a test that would be adequate to measure performance. Now that was the first idea. So this was going to be the vehicle by which policymakers would get leverage. The second idea was not so much about how standards can act as the carriers of curricular values, but rather about what those values should be. And in the 1990s, you had a number of state assessments that reflected a particular view of how students learn most effectively. The assumption was that rote memorization of facts didn't result, in the sustained, worthwhile knowledge that students need. Rather, according to this view, students should learn in a way that would allow them to think critically, to solve problems, to apply knowledge in unfamiliar situations. The assumption was that teaching for understanding is most likely to occur if students have the opportunities to construct their own learning through hands-on experiments, through different kinds of projects, through interactions with other students, and through the application of knowledge and skills in unfamiliar situations or in solving problems. What happened then was that national associations representing educators, such as the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, then developed content and performance standards, and these were then adopted in a number of states. Now, as I will discuss in a few minutes, these ideas became the focal point for the mobilization of groups opposed to the curricular views that were represented in this kind of pedagogical philosophy. Now today, in the aftermath of what became known as the math and the reading wars, we have basically a different set of curricular values reflected in the assessments that most states are now administering. Rather than this kind of constructivist approach to pedagogy that we had in the 1990s, recent federal and state policies promote a much more kind of traditional notion of curriculum and the values underlying it. And that would be evidenced in the Bush Reading First initiative, in California's current language arts and mathematics standards. But the basic point remains. Student assessments are considerably more than neutral instruments for measuring student achievement. They're also being used to shape classroom instruction, and in doing so, to promote a particular set of curricular values, whether those are traditional or progressive. For example, now just the fact that No Child Left Behind is measuring student achievement in reading and mathematics means that other subjects that are not being tested are being taught less than they would have been in the past. So it's basically sending a strong signal about what's considered important for students to know. So we have two reasons. Policymakers wanting to get leverage, and then having a way to do that. The third reason why policymakers selected student assessment as a strategy for influencing classroom instruction is a very straightforward one. It's seemingly a very low-cost strategy. Whatever we may think of politicians on any given day, they're usually rational. In order to keep their jobs, they need to solve problems as cost efficiently as possible so as not to anger their tax-paying constituents. So one way to minimize the costs at their level is to pass those costs down to lower levels so that finding the necessary resources becomes someone else's problem. The direct costs of developing, administering, and scoring standardized assessments are relatively small, depending on the kind of assessment, $10 to $20 a student. And these costs are quite small when you think about the other related costs. When you think about the cost of training teachers to teach new curricula, developing and providing necessary instructional materials, ensuring sufficient learning opportunities for students to master the content in which they're going to be tested, and also then considering these opportunity costs that when you have a very extensive testing regime that's focused on a few subjects, other subjects may not be taught. Now, states have differed in how much of these related costs they've been willing to bear and how much they've pushed down to local districts. But even in those states that have been willing to bear a larger share, there's no question that a majority of the costs have been borne by local communities. So in this sense, assessment policy looks like a good deal for the states and an even better deal for the federal government. It appears to be powerful but relatively inexpensive way to impose curricular values on schools. So how effective has assessment policy been as a strategy for pursuing this policy goal? The answer has two dimensions, a political one and an educational one. Let me talk first about the political one. Political battles about what should be taught in the public schools aren't new, and they erupt on a fairly regular basis. The focus of these have ranged from sex education to Afrocentrism and on to intelligent design. The ensuing fights typically are confined to a few communities at a time, but they usually reflect divisions in the larger society. What was perhaps most unusual about the political mobilization around standards and testing that occurred in California, Kentucky, and a number of other states in the 1990s was that it came as a big surprise to policymakers and to testing experts alike. Past controversies had centered on textbooks or specific curriculum, like, for example, for sex education. But in fact, until the 1990s in the standards movement, standardized tests were designed to measure students' achievement regardless of which curriculum they were taught. And so studies at the time found very little overlap between what was tested and what was taught. But with its goal of aligning curriculum and assessments, the standards movement attempted to change that relationship. So as a result, we might argue that the policymakers who set out to transmit curricular values through student assessments were the victims of their own success, because in some cases, these values were seen as so powerful they became a catalyst for opposing views. Now, because the groups that fought the reading wars in California were quite different than in their motivations and their political ideologies than those that waged the math wars, the specific reasons for their opposition are less important than the fact that curricular values embodied in state standards and transmitted through student assessments were the basis for mobilization. And in my view, I think that's the most important policy implication. Assessments designed to change classroom instruction are not value neutral. They transmit strong messages about what knowledge and skills are valued, thus placing them squarely in the realm of political debate and contention. Now, in my book, I devote considerable space to the kinds of political actions that were taken by these opposition groups, particularly to the state assessment that was operative in California in the mid-1990s. Some of you may remember it, the California Learning Assessment System, CLAS. It's a fascinating story because it demonstrates how a small vocal minority can derail a major issue through grassroots mobilization combined with state-level political action. I'm not going to say much here about the movement except to note that it was focused on the language arts assessment. It was spearheaded by a coalition of culturally conservative groups that came to be known as part of the religious right. The objections to the assessment included charges that the reading passages promoted inappropriate values such as violence and disrespect for authority and for people of religious faith, that the questions measured the student's psyche and got into areas that should be only part of the family life, that the assessment did not measure students' abilities to write grammatically or spell correctly. The opposition strategies included the filing of lawsuits to block administration of the test, parental boycotts of the test and other kinds of grassroots activity, testimony before the legislature and the State Board of Education, and the lobbying of individual legislators. Now, these opposition groups were relatively small. Only about 5% of California students were opted out of the test by their parents, and most of these groups had only a few thousand members. But they were successful in keeping class from being reauthorized, and in a few isolated communities, parental protests were quite intense. In fact, some of you may remember the opposition activities here at several Goleta elementary schools. Now, the subsequent opposition to the mathematics standards that occurred in the late 1990s was quite different. It had no cultural or religious overtones. It included both political conservatives and liberals. In fact, at one point, when these standards were being considered by the Standards Commission in the state, the chair of UC Berkeley's mathematics department was supporting what were essentially more constructivist standards. The chair of the mathematics department at Stanford was opposing them. And he was opposing them because he felt the teachers did not have sufficient training to teach them. But both men saw this as basically an intellectual disagreement. And these disagreements were over the balance between basic skills and conceptual learning, between direct instruction and discovery-based learning, and over the degree to which traditionally separate subdisciplines within mathematics, such as algebra and geometry, should be integrated in student coursework. There were also debates about the amount and the specificity of the content that students should be expected to learn. Now, although the groups in these two instances were very different, they tapped into concerns that were shared by larger segments of parents and the public. Surveys about the teaching of mathematics and writing that were conducted at the time pointed to fundamental differences between the curricular values of education reformers and large segments of the public. For example, in 1994, there was a public agenda survey and found that 86% of the respondents in this national sample said that students should learn to do arithmetic by hand, including memorizing multiplication tables before starting to use calculators. This opinion contrasted with 82% of mathematics educators who were responding to an earlier survey who said that early use of calculators would improve children's problem-solving skills and would not prevent the learning of arithmetic. This survey also found these similar differences in the opinions of educators and the general public about how to teach writing, in the value of teaching students in heterogeneous ability groups, and it was this seeming inconsistency between the reform goals and parental expectations that these opposition groups in California and in other states were able to use to their advantage. Now, for a variety of educational and political reasons I don't have time to go into, the curricular values that are embodied in the current most standards and assessments today are much more traditional than they were a decade ago. And they reflect perspectives that are much closer to where the American public is. Nevertheless, the experience of California and other states in the 1990s demonstrates why policymakers have to strike a balance between advancing curricular values that are powerful and precise enough to influence classroom teaching while also being broadly acceptable to the very diverse constituencies of public education. So that's the political response, which was, in some cases, these values were so powerful they mobilized opposition. What about the educational response? On the educational dimension, there have been at least 20 studies over the past 15 years that have found a consistent effect of state assessments on curriculum and teaching. Together, these studies, and most of them are small, they focused on 13 states. They've relied on a variety of data, including teacher surveys and interviews, classroom observations, and also content analyses of teachers' instructional materials. The effects they identified are mixed. At the one end of the continuum, there's no question that more time is now spent preparing students to take exams. And some of this is, test prep of the kind that is quite mechanical, how do you bubble in the answer sheet? Others is focused more on the academic content. State assessments have narrowed the curriculum because less time is being spent on non-tested subjects. For example, in the most recent study that the Center of Education Policy has done on No Child Left Behind, they found that 71% of the districts in their study sample were reporting that teachers were spending less time on subjects that weren't specified for testing under the federal law. And one of the subjects that's being diminished in the elementary school curriculum, which is near and dear to many of us, is social studies. What's also happened, because more students are being tested more often, is that these tests have changed to become more traditional. They're more multiple choice than they were, say, 10 years ago, or just even prior to No Child Left Behind, where you had writing prompts, you had open-ended responses where students would have to develop problems. As the tests have become more traditional, there's evidence that teachers' classroom tests and their teaching has also reflected that. On the more positive end of the continuum, schools are now focusing much more on aligning their curriculum with state standards and assessments. Teachers are also more likely to use test data to target and adjust their instruction given students' academic strengths and weaknesses. Now, two findings from my study, I think, and these are consistent with the results of other research, I think have clear policy implications. A number of the studies that were done before No Child Left Behind allowed people to compare teachers in states that had low-stakes assessment with those that had high-stakes assessment. And what we found was that classroom practice changed in response to state assessments that espoused particular curricular philosophies. And these changes occurred whether or not the state used the test to impose meaningful consequences on schools. So the case was that even where states were only generating information for public review, putting it in the newspaper, that appeared to be as powerful an incentive as the threat of sanctions or the promise of rewards. Now, the current high-stakes emphasis in testing assumes that neither the values that are embodied in the assessment nor the information that they generate are sufficient in themselves to change classroom behavior and raise student achievement. Yet considerable evidence suggests that the public disclosure of test scores and appeals to professional values can change educators' behavior. Now, although it's a tentative kind of conclusion and it requires more information about the kind of high-stakes environment that we're now in, I think one policy implication from past research then is that this rush to high-stakes testing could be slowed and could be balanced by a greater emphasis on motivating teachers through appeals to their sense of professionalism and the worth of the curricular values that are being transmitted through the standards and the assessment. A second policy implication relates to the fact that although classroom practice changed in response to assessments, the extent of that change has been quite limited. It depends heavily on the nature of professional development opportunities for teachers, and it typically involves shifts in classroom activities rather than how students are taught conceptual understandings about a test. So, for example, when you had a more kind of constructivist pedagogy, what you saw was that teachers were introducing group work, they were using manipulatives in, say, mathematics, elementary mathematics instruction, but they weren't focusing on helping students understand mathematical concepts or applying them to new situations. So the policy implication of this finding, I think, is straightforward. Although student testing appears to be an inexpensive reform for those at the top of the system, you get what you pay for. And if federal and state officials want standards and assessment policies implemented successfully, they're going to need to pay more. Transforming the essence of instruction through assessment is not a self-implementing reform. Using state assessments to alter instruction can be effective only if it's supported by a very strong infrastructure of teacher training and instructional materials. Yet one finding across a variety of studies of curricular reforms and testing is that teachers are rarely given such opportunities. Most professional development opportunities are brief, and they focus on the specifics of a state test rather than on its broader curricular implications. So consequently, it's not surprising that the kind of changes that are occurring in most classrooms are quite shallow. Okay, now I've spent most of my time discussing what might be considered an almost hidden goal of assessment policy. Nevertheless, I think it's important to keep in mind that no matter what kind of testing regime is in place, it does transmit a set of curricular values just by the skills and knowledge it measures. And this is particularly important in the context of the current standards movement, where the goal is to align, specifically to align assessment and curriculum. I want to spend just a few minutes commenting on the second mechanism, which is the second strategy or goal of policy, and that is basically to use it as an accountability mechanism. Assessment has become a tool of political accountability for two reasons. One is based on a normative political ideal, and one on political interest. The first is grounded in democratic theory, and it assumes that as public servants working in public institutions, educators should be accountable to the citizens and to their elected representatives for the operation of schools and for student learning. Now, the chain of logic that gets you from this normative belief that there should be accountability to why should it be assessment. What it is it's based on the assumption that educators know a lot more about what occurs in schools than do either politicians or the public. And this serious information asymmetry has hindered efforts to hold schools accountable. So consequently, there's a necessity for some kind of externally imposed, standardized instrument to provide comparable data on schools and students, and thus equalizing the information available to everyone with a stake in the system. Now, I'm certain some of you are sitting there saying, all right, even if the assumptions about democratic control are valid, why does the accountability mechanism have to be so reliant on testing, and why does it have to be directed from the federal and the state level? Now, last week, I've been grading my undergraduate students' midterms, and a number of them have argued that because teachers are professional, they're in a better position than either the federal or state officials to decide how to improve learning opportunities for their students, and that teachers, local administrators, and school board members should be able to play more of a role in devising accountability mechanisms that are credible in their own communities. And I'm giving them a good grade if they say that. But part of the answer to why educational accountability is now so heavily based on top-down assessments and not on strategies that are either more professionally oriented or locally focused lies in a second political reason for the strong link between assessment and accountability goals. Now, if you think back about 20 years to the post-nation at risk context, several factors characterize that environment, and these are key to understanding how assessment evolved as an accountability mechanism. Remember, the impetus for reform then came not from within the educational establishment, but from outside, largely from the business community. Although many questioned the validity of this assumed relationship, it was put forth that improved K-12 education would be a major solution to the problem of the United States' weakened inability to compete in the global economy. So there was this link between education and the economy. In addition, the education establishment was viewed as incapable of undertaking needed reforms on its own because it was viewed as part of the problem. Now, analyses at the time showed that the quality of the teaching force had seriously diminished and curriculum standards had become less rigorous, especially in comparison to some of the United States' global trading partners. So state officials were in this situation. They had to respond to these growing demands to do something to fix the system. And these demands were especially intense in the South, where education reform was clearly framed as an economic development issue. In a number of states, public and business elites were willing to accept higher taxes, and a variety of reforms got passed, including higher teacher salaries, increased course requirements for high school graduation, expanded early childhood education, updated textbooks, and other instructional materials. And state assessments at that point became the quid pro quo for new resources coming to schools. As several of my respondents said, it was a way to fix responsibility and accountability, and it was to make certain that their resources paid off. Now, my brief sketch explains why assessment policy came on the state policy agenda, but doesn't explain why has it stayed there for 20 years and actually expanded in prominence. Part of the reason is that elites and the public still perceive that there's serious problems with the public schools. The problem is currently framed less explicitly around economic competitiveness and more around the achievement gap. The fact that some groups of students repeatedly score significantly below other groups of students. And the achievement gap has been framed as a social justice issue, reflecting the effects of generations of unequal schooling and societal discrimination that have to be remedied. But economic framing is also still present. Many of those in the entry-level labor force are unprepared for 21st century jobs because they've received poor schooling. That's the current framing of the policy problem. But why do standards and assessment still play such a prominent role in the policy solution to the achievement gap? Like a good political scientist, I'm going to argue both an ideas and an interest explanation. The idea-based explanation is simply that along with vouchers and parental choice, standards and assessment are currently the only big ideas out there animating discussions about education reform. Consequently, policymakers wishing to address their constituents' concerns about school quality have few alternatives from which they can choose if they want to diminish testing's preeminence as a reform strategy. So that's the idea-based explanation. There just aren't many big ideas out there. The interest-based explanation posits that while there's opposition to the current uses of assessment, it's diffuse, and no one has offered a sufficiently compelling and viable alternative. Despite clear divisions on other social policies in this country right now, student testing is not a left-right issue. If you think about the traditional Democratic constituency base, it's divided. On the one hand, you have civil rights groups and groups representing poor children supporting No Child Left Behind. You have the teacher unions opposing it. If you look on the right, you have a conservative Republican president who advocated No Child Left Behind and continues to stand firmly behind it, as does the Business Roundtable, while other members of his party see it as unwelcome federal intrusion in local communities. Another source of opposition to No Child Left Behind have been state officials who see it as an unfunded federal mandate. They would like the federal requirements to be diminished or to be weakened, but they still intend to maintain some type of state assessment as an accountability device. They just want to be in charge of it. So at this point, my prediction is that student testing is unlikely to diminish as a tool of education reform anytime soon. The 2007 reauthorization of No Child Left Behind is going to be an opportunity to fix parts of the law that haven't worked well, but the revisions are unlikely to alter the core of the policy. Considerable public opinion and behavioral evidence indicate that policymakers and the public want a mechanism that ensures political accountability of schools and also allocates scarce resources in a seemingly fair and impartial way. So now, if we look at the public opinion data, we find that policymakers and the public do appear to understand that tests are limited in the quality and the comprehensiveness of the information they produce. But large majorities continue to support their use, particularly because no alternatives have been identified to serve these critical functions, that is, accountability and some way to allocate scarce resources. Therefore, I would argue it makes sense in the current context to focus on improving assessment systems, since the basic concept is likely to persist in one form or another. And I think that recognizing the values that underlie assessment policies and understanding how such policies operate to change behavior are crucial to any effort to improve them. So I'm just going to conclude by reiterating two major implications of my research and then pose two questions. The first implication is simply, as I've said, assessments are not value neutral. And I think that this is important to keep in mind as we think about the long-term consequences of testing, not just how well students have learned, but what have they learned. What subjects are being diminished or disappearing from the curriculum as a result of this testing regime. The second point, again, assessments are neither inexpensive nor self-implementing reforms. We've got to pay a lot more attention to capacity building in the system. And then, my questions. Can educators be held accountable to the public and still have sufficient discretion to exercise professional judgment in deciding how best to educate their students? Can we balance this valid, legitimate demand for political accountability with some sort of professional judgment and professional accountability? How can those two be balanced? And then finally, in a country that's very impatient for quick results, and where the nature of public institutions is changing dramatically, how long can standards and accountability continue to be the big idea that supports, the sustained support for public schooling? And what I'm asking here is, we have a major movement in this country towards outsourcing, towards privatization of a variety of governmental functions. Standards and assessment, in some sense, is keeping the lid on that within public education, but that may change. Thank you.
From the perspective of educational research, Professor Richard Durant.
Thank you. Lorraine's book has so much in it that there's quite a bit to orient to, and my notes and comments will be somewhat nonlinear, but thematically tied to some of the principal points that she makes. In her book, Lorraine talks about what she terms hortatory policy instruments, which are belief systems about what education should be about, how tests are part of a belief system about students being able to attain standards by means of tests as tools to be able to gain evidence of their competence in standards, and then the role that they might play in the expectation that schools and teachers and school systems will take these exhortations for improving schools without adequate resources to be able to turn these beliefs as creeds to then feel a conscience and ethic about implementing change. One way to view this is in terms of what I might term naive theories of action. And I use naive not in the everyday sense of something that's oversimplistic, but naive almost in the sense of like naive set theory, if you've ever seen that book. There's more to it, right, Julian? It's not quite as simplistic as you think. But what is important from thinking about these theories of action are that they involve beliefs that are stated in terms such as standards and framing of evidence of students attaining standards by taking the words, their statements of standards, and then converting those words into further beliefs about what should students know and be able to do in terms of classroom practices and systems then that test developers and the technology of testing operationalize in order to create test items that allegedly connect with standards, that allegedly connect with what occurs in classrooms, and that allegedly would connect with what teachers do in classrooms. Lorraine's book state some things that I think are somewhat, I interpret somewhat a little bit different from her own comments today, but I think consistent if we examine them in more depth. One is a key notion that we might term opportunity to learn, which is a notion that's used a lot in the field of education policy to refer to what actually happens in classrooms that support students' learning and achievement. And if played out with regard to issues of standards and what are on tests, then presumably then there are technologies, practices that schools enable and that teachers are able to follow that then get converted into actual goings-on in a classroom between students and teachers and students and each other, and then relationships between those practices in classrooms and sense-making, meaning-making opportunities in other environments. There are problems with this. And in her book, and I didn't notice it as much in the talk, but it's there if you dig deeper, is the issue that tests can never be adequate indicators of opportunity to learn. At best, what they can do is to shine a spotlight on skills that, when taken out of isolation of classroom practices and social practices and cultural practices, you can make a logical argument that those skills are represented on a test item, and you can make an empirical argument that students who show these skills then are capable of showing performances on other indicators that would be associated with going ahead in education. Often themselves, as other indicators are themselves other tests. What is not addressed well and indicated in Lorraine's book is that the actual interactional practices in classrooms and the actual goings-on in the classroom are a different level of reality than what can be represented on tests. It's a very important issue. Now, in terms of this issue of the hortatory arguments, the exhortations to improve classroom practices based on what tests show us about performance, there's another point that's in Lorraine's book that is worthwhile bringing forth, and that is that the costs under a hortatory orientation, the costs for being able to put practice to operationalize beliefs about what should happen in classrooms gets put down into the system and ends up being in classrooms and schools and in ultimately in high-stakes assessment on students. I'm hoping that Professor Pohl might comment on some of these perspectives from the viewpoint of the Santa Barbara School District and these policy instruments, their hortatory commentary called the Single Plan for Student Achievement, which are allegedly supposed to deal with the achievement gap by exhorting that teachers and curriculum practices converge on trying to help students attain these goals that are specified through the rhetoric of standards, but which end up finding a different kind of reality in the classrooms, the realities of students who are alienated at times from classrooms, who've been socialized into believing that they can't be successful, into contexts where they begin to show counter behavior to what's expected of them of schooling as they endure the practices of schooling. And this raises, of course, the issue of the socialization practices that are occurring in schools that are associated with the achievement gap. So there are problems here. There are deeper social problems that surround testing. When Lorraine says there just aren't many big ideas out there about how to change schooling, I think that can be challenged, but it's going to fall into the same set of issues that she raises in her books, that different interest groups will have a different degree of being able to stomach what the implications are about thinking, for example, about how to deal with student diversity and the difference between the resources that students have in their home and natal communities and the resources that are privileged in the classroom and dealing with that kind of difference and the change in belief systems that would be required in order for teachers to be supported in adopting different kinds of beliefs about what students can do. So we have problems, serious problems in terms of thinking through how changing the framing for big issues would clash with the beliefs of people who are afraid of difference, who are afraid of acknowledging differences in resources and the traditions that people bring from other backgrounds into schooling. If we could only say this was just a problem of the U.S. society and schooling would be one thing. It's a global problem. A global problem that has global dimensions and that is part of the global clash of cultures and belief systems that we're embedded in and that are affecting our schools as well through immigrant persons coming into our schools and communities, and our inability to learn how to be able to take a perspective that I will term human development oriented. And I don't mean individual human development, I mean development of identities that are appropriate to show improved schooling performance as connected to social development. As opposed, now another axis we might call the reductionist perspective, which is that tests are able to adequately capture what it means to become skilled and competent. What's missing from the equation of the testing community, and I'm a member of that community, and I'm schizoid, it's okay. I can shine the spotlight in a narrow manner and say this is what you can learn when you look at it this way, but I'm so gravely aware of what can't be shown. And what is not captured at present by tests, and never will be and shouldn't be, is the character of human agency that happens when you become a competent participant in a learning community where the understandings are happen through interaction and through support of practices that are considered to be indicators of competence. Now, what's funny, if you look at this carefully, and you know, some of my students and colleagues know I'm kind of a Vygotskian type, is that feedback, social regulation and feedback are very important to human development. So, in a weird way, there should be more testing, not less testing, but that what we call assessment, the regulation of performance and ability to give feedback to learners about the quality of their performances is a very central, important matter. But that version of assessment is very different from the version of an assessment that happens as part of a large-scale assessment. It's even different from what happens in terms of classroom-based assessments and where teachers are trying to diagnose where their students are at, or formative assessments where they're trying to track their progress. While those ways of looking at assessment are valued, what's not captured, and maybe shouldn't be captured, I don't think at all, but is very important and central to socialization, is the regulation of beliefs about capacity and about making meaning that's shared. Now, so there, I would run into the concerns of people who would be anti-constructivist, of course. That's okay. There's room for that. Let me just close my comments by saying today, of course, is a very significant day for high-stakes assessment in California. A decision was supposed to be announced this afternoon at 2 o'clock regarding an injunction to stop the implementation of the California high school exit exam for seniors who are graduating this spring. So I think we're living through the issues that Lorraine has raised, and we're seeing them again now being played out. The polities are complex. There are people who have many different kinds of beliefs about what schools should be about. But in line with what Lorraine has argued in her book, as I infer meaning from it, and I guess I could be accused of saying I'm looking to support my values by her arguments, even though she may not be making this. She's very good at pointing out that dilemma to us, though. She critiques us well. The costs are being passed down. The costs are instead of just the schools being inadequate and the teachers not having the capacities that would be desirable or the curriculum not, it's just the students don't have the capacity. And that model is a reductionist model that is not about development. It's about looking at students as being accountable for their own learning in a way that does not provide them support for their own learning. So, I mean, that's part of what this is about. So I'll close with that comment.
From a member of the local school board, and thoughts on how they respond to this, as Richard pointed out, pushing it downward, Bob Noel.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and especially to honor Lorraine McDonnell, who is my teacher in this area. I'm from international relations and strategic theory and nuclear deterrence, and somehow I found myself on a local school board, perhaps because I have young children, and the learning curve. Julie Weiss' class helped me up the first step of it. I resisted tremendously, and Lorraine has helped me farther up the curve, and I continue to learn, and found her book extremely helpful. I don't think I can comment all that meaningfully on it in the context within which it was written, but I do have some thoughts about it from a standpoint of both a political scientist and a member of a local governing board of a school district. And I certainly agree. As I read the first parts of it particularly, I thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly it. I can recall a meeting in which an alternative school was called upon to present its self-evaluation and why it's doing a good job. And they handed the board about 150 portfolios, because they did portfolio assessment. Now, how we can then aggregate in any kind of, that's a loaded word, objective, but in any kind of a way that would transcend the 150 subjectivities to come out with a evaluation of a school is impossibility, especially in a 2-hour board meeting. And you immediately find yourself grasping for some kind of indicators, some kind of aggregate measures. Maybe reducing it to a single number is to trivialize, but you certainly feel this impulse to want to have a set of something objective, qualitative, verbal, numerical, whatever, that you can say, all right, let us locate this school in terms of those performance dimensions, and let us now compare it to other schools in terms of those same dimensions. So, and thus the rationale, the one that makes sense to me for some kind of assessment to help us as policymakers in the accountability function. And I don't see any escape from it. And the history of it has been, I think, from floundering starts to coming along pretty well in the state of California. The Academic Performance Index is the single number, the magic number, to which all schools' performance gets reduced in some sense. That index has grown and become more sophisticated and elaborate, now containing a number of independent dimensions combined in a fairly sophisticated way, weighting different subject matter areas and so on. It has also grown in the sense that now we have an API, an Academic Performance Index, not just for the school as a whole, but for the socioeconomically and demographically relevant subgroups within a school. So you can look on the state database and find an API for socioeconomically disadvantaged students. You can find an Academic Performance Index for every ethnic subgroup if they constitute 15% of the population, and for English learners, again, if they constitute 15%, and for students with disabilities, if they constitute 15% of the student population. So you can put together a profile of how a school is doing now in a more refined way, and I think that the state of California has some justifiable pride in the development of that index. And it certainly helps us at the local level to have a common vocabulary. It's also done something that I want to just comment on. I don't know how this fits in, but maybe it fits very nicely with Lorraine's thesis about, I can't say that word, hortatory? Exhortational policy. That's easier for me, okay? And that is that what's happened when you go to the schools and when you sit in on meetings at the district level, that the API is now a common part of the culture of the schools. Everybody understands it. Maybe not accurately, but they think they understand it. Everybody sees it as a goal, and it's always discussed. So that before that, there was no kind of single salient focal point for efforts to improve. Here's this benchmark, and it's really permeated the culture of the schools, and I think helped people focus more on reform and curriculum reform and on improved instruction and trying to help kids who need help. So in that sense, I understand what Ryan's book is about, and I applaud those developments in assessment. I certainly also agree that assessment as a driving force for curriculum change, first of all, it is, and secondly, it is fundamentally political. The content of what is taught in public schools is a political issue, by definition. And therefore, anything that assesses what is taught in public schools becomes part of that political issue. And indeed, changing the assessment can change what's taught. And people will teach the test. There's no question about it. I've always been troubled by that, but by the same token, when I now see the broader notion of alignment of the curriculum, of the testing, of the textbooks with the California content standards, then it says, how's the whole package? If the standards are good, and if they are teaching well to the standards, then maybe teaching the test isn't all that bad. Now, it's taken a long time. In my tenure on the school board, 7 years, about 6 of those have been spent following the development of alignment. How do you make sure that all of these components are in place? And especially the California Standards Test. The early API didn't even have the California Standards Test. That is, test items designed to get at exactly what is on the wall of every classroom in Santa Barbara, right up here, the standards for that class. Social studies, 5th grade, here is what the kids will be taught in that class. Here's what they'll be taught in science. And the standards are simply lists of subject matters. Now, there was a huge debate about what the standards should contain, and it brought up a lot of the arguments between constructivist learning and more traditional learning. But that's been at least resolved in a political sense for a while, such that now there's no more quarrel about those standards. Right? So if the assessment is well aligned, if the textbooks are well aligned, if instruction is well aligned, then there is some kind of, I think, reasonable logic that this package, including teaching to the test, is a meaningful package for educational reform. As Lorraine says, it's the only game in town right now. So that's my kind of take on that aspect of it. A couple of things that I wanted to bring up that perhaps come more from my own experience, and that has to do with the way parents use assessments. And this is something that we get all the time. Parents read these things. It usually comes out in the news press, a large matrix with all the test scores, and now sometimes with the subgroup test scores. And parents then want to make what they consider to be intelligent educational choices for their kids. Okay? How do they do this? Well, they don't get a lot of help. They don't get a lot of help reading and understanding what test scores are about. But the information is there if they know how to use it. My experience is that very few, I just have to find a diplomatic way to put it, they don't get a lot of help. They don't get a lot of help from the district on how to to tease out what they need to know. One of the reasons is because there is I guess it's also a kind of political reason. No district wants its schools to be in competition with one another. The Santa Barbara district has an open enrollment policy within the district. And if you start really parsing the schools by test scores, you can find differences. And if people believe, if they have faith in the testing, and a lot of them don't, and they don't get on their bicycle and go just because the scores are higher down on the other side of town, but a lot of them do. And this of course creates a lot of the kind of phenomena that we read about in the paper and that we are concerned about. For example, what is usually called white flight. Right? I pick up a term down in Englewood at a school which has a remarkable record dealing with highly disadvantaged kids, minority kids in an inner city. She said, our problem down here is bright flight. It doesn't have any color. Is that the bright kids leave and go elsewhere. And she was talking particularly about kids coming out of very powerful elementary programs that are doing miracles in Englewood, kind of a set of the kind of high flyers are called. And I said, well, where do they go in junior high school? Because you look at the junior highs in Englewood and they don't look so good. Again, looking at through test score data. And the lady at the junior high says, yeah, well, that's because all the districts around here want our good graduates. We have bright flight. Okay. Well, I think we've had a lot of that in Santa Barbara. The Hope District is a fine school district down here around Turnpike Road. 3 schools, high socioeconomic status, high parental education, almost all proficient in English. Those are the 3 big variables that we use normally when we think about the determinants of academic performance. And we've lost a lot of students to the Hope District for that. I call it bright flight. The news press called it white flight. You take your choice. You probably know some of the parents, and you can make those judgments yourselves. But that is a concern, and I don't really have a kind of a strong position. I think parents have a right to know everything they can learn about the relative performance of schools. I think parents have a right to make decisions. But as a policymaker, I hate to see our district lose good students to other districts. And I'd like to see us, coping with that in a constructive way. Actually, what's happened to the Hope District is just shut it down, in case and they're phasing that out as the new waves of kindergartners come in, and that for their own reasons, which I won't go into, but very much to their advantage to do so. Another area that I am concerned about, and that hasn't been discussed except a little bit from Richard Duran, and that is in-class assessment. You have the state assessments up here. The state assessments are they do the testing around May, and the results come in preliminary in the summer. They always say June, but usually it's August. Students move on to another teacher, and the secondary schools on to other teachers. And then the test results come in. It's a big logistic problem to try to get the results for each kid into the hands of each new teacher. And I can't tell you where we stand in our district on that, but I know a lot of energy was put into that. So that insofar as possible, you would like that one assessment that you've got for everybody, you'd like to have it drive instruction. You'd like to have teachers be able to meet, and we know they do this. They meet in teams, they look at the assessment data, and try to figure out how best to move ahead with these kids. That's a great thing, right? But it only happens once a year. And everything I've read, and I'd refer to my colleagues in educational research, but everything I've read says that assessment should be frequent, with frequent feedback to teachers. And that sounds like in-class testing. And to my knowledge, there is no coherent plan, at least in our school district, that in any way tries to integrate or unify in-class assessments. Those are very much in the domain of the individual teacher, if I understand it correctly. Okay. How frequent? It depends on the teacher. What are the consequences? This brings me to a point that I do feel very strongly about. If you can picture a model where you do frequent in-class testing, what happens if you find a kid who is blossoming, mastering that material very quickly, ready to move ahead? What do you do with them? Well, you know, there are some strategies that talk about differentiated instruction within the single class, but I believe that is very limited. In lower grades, more effective. It doesn't make much sense at all in secondary school. Okay. But what happens is we have alignment now between the curriculum, between the tests, textbooks, right? But we don't have alignment with the structure of the curriculum itself. And by that I mean, if you find this kid who is blossoming and you find him, say, in January, you have no place to put him. You can't put them in, especially this is true in the junior high schools, where you have tracking. Okay, if you find a kid that's ready to move up, but not quite ready to go into the next to the higher level classes, where do you put them? We haven't been at all creative in trying to find new ways to organize the delivery of the materials in smaller units, so we can have that kind of flexibility to move kids around more. They do it in some of the schools, in Mastery Learning at Monroe School. They do some pull-out work, in some of the other schools. But I don't think we've scratched the surface there, where in-class assessments can guide us not only in driving instruction, providing help for the individual kid, but for then moving kids through the curriculum in different ways than we have in the past. Let me respond to you, Richard, about the single plan for student achievement. That's required by state legislation in the Education Code, and that is a plan that every school has to prepare. That first of all evaluates their past performance and says, here's what we're going to do henceforth. But it's very important to note this, and this almost falls off the radar scope. It has nothing to do with general fund expenditures that drive our schools day in and day out. The single plans are what drive so-called categorical expenditures. That's money from the federal government in a variety of different federal programs, money from the state government in a variety of different state programs. All categorical expenditures now are developed on the single plan for student achievement. Every school has to have it, and that then goes in as part of the application, so-called consolidated application for those funds. There's supposed to be a linkage back to the single plan. In that process, when you read the federal regulations and the state regulations, there is an evaluation component. Every year, there's supposed to be an evaluation of all these categorical programs. It may happen in LAUSD, but it doesn't happen much on the Central Coast, to my experience, not in Santa Barbara. Those evaluations tend to be self-evaluations. There's no assessment in the sense in which we're using that word in this panel. The whole mechanism, see, it's kind of interesting as I listen to this discussion. We have a mechanism called testing and publication of results, low stakes or high stakes. It's kind of a self-regulatory system. But in this area, and categorical expenditures are a lot of money, designed for disadvantaged kids. In this area, there's no systematic evaluation. There's no automatic regulatory mechanism. The regulation comes when the state every 4 years sends down a team and does what's called a coordinated compliance review. They ask questions. I've gone to one of their workshops. My impression is that what they look for is, did you go through the procedure? It's almost like empty tubes. The content's not there. And if you go through the procedure, much like if you go through the singles plan procedure, you've now satisfied the requirement. That to me is an area where some kind of, if assessment is needed, I would suggest that would be I'd love to see assessments driving some change in that area. If you're interested, I've written a report on that, on Title I expenditures. I put some copies over there to give you an idea it's very complex, but an idea for how any kind of rational, coherent control in that area is, to be desired, but we're a long way from there. I wanted to just call attention with a couple of closing remarks. I really like the idea, especially of hortatory public policy, and I think it's the, kind of, as you say, Lorraine, if you embed your mandates and your rules and requirements into a context that is more value-oriented and persuasive, the whole package looks very good. I just want to call your attention to some of the limits, okay? The first one I passed out. Do you all have one of these? She'll get you one of those. Do you have one of these? All right, let me just, this is my favorite statistical document of all time. Russ, I talked to you about this one. This document, this shows on the x-axis SCI, that stands for School Characteristics Index. And that's developed as about a 16-variable regression equation that the California Department of Education has developed, taking all kinds of characteristics of schools, characteristic of kids, teacher mobility, student mobility, how many credentialed, how many non-credentialed, language facility, economics, and rendering it into a single index number. They're arrayed across the bottom. On the y-axis is the academic performance indicator. And what to me is so significant about this is that it shows you, number one, that if you, let's just look in at like at 130 on the characteristics index and give it some slop there, give it some fuzz for error, somewhere around 130. The theory here is that those schools are sort of similar. Certainly a lot more like each other than the schools out here at the other end and so on. Now look at the variability in academic performance for that up and down a vertical line you draw through 130. You've got easily, without even going to the outliers, 250 points difference in this combined index of academic performance. What this says is that public policies, that there's hope for public policy. I see this as a measure of hope. We can expect schools who are low and those similar schools to improve because other schools have done so. And in terms of the variables that we think determine academic performance, those schools are very similar. Okay? Similarly, at the high end, I drew a line up from 175. And there again, it's easy to, just roughly, you can find about a 250 point difference. Lots of room for improvement. Okay? That to me is the hope in these data. The despair in these data is that the highest scores at the low end of socioeconomic characteristics, of demographic characteristics, are lower than the lowest scores at the high end. And that, folks, I think is James Coleman. That is, and it's also Russ Rumberger. That is the constraint that seems to be set by demographics. And no matter how imaginative and no matter how you package up your public policies, that was the one that is so resistant to change. Now the other one, this is kind of the other chart I wanted to show you. Also, and this is, I guess I'd have to label this as a little bit of criticism of an existing public policy. While we talk about, and I talked with, I think I praise the California model, the API model. I do not praise what they call the California growth model. And that, that is a policy that is in place, but it's embedded in a couple of very small formulas. And if you look at the third line, calculating growth, look at those formulas, you'll find that the growth expectations in California are 5% of the difference between a school's academic performance index and 800, which is arbitrarily taken by the state as a target. 5% of the difference, okay? Then that gets modified a little bit, because as they get up to 780, the growth expectation is 1 API point a year until 800. So I simply went through our schools, and if you look down the left column, you'll see the name of the schools and a little bit about the schools demographically. And what you'll see then is that if you, according to the California growth model, the expectations, if a school were to meet its growth targets by this formula every year, and that's not easy to do every year, year in and year out, Cleveland Elementary would achieve 800 in 2049. Franklin Elementary would achieve it in 2061. Harding Elementary would achieve it in 2055. Okay, I won't go on. That I would not call that much of a rigorous growth model. More interesting, of course, we have some that are already there, so there is no expectation. But look down at the bottom, because I wanted to calculate what it does, what the implications are for the achievement gap. And this one, once you see it, you can look at the math and prove it. It's just right in the arithmetic. I took Monroe Elementary because it's a diverse school. It's got minorities and it's got non-minorities. It's got Latinos. It's got and if you calculate the difference in performance between the white subgroup, 881 API in 2004, and the Latino subgroup, 690 in 2004. And let me say, 690 is a pretty good score if you look at Latino APIs around the state of California. So Monroe has nothing to be ashamed of. That's a very good performance. But the gap is 191 points. And no matter how you calculate it, if you look out at 2061, it's still 191 points. That's an error. That is a mathematical artifact. It makes the whole growth model, to me, a joke. Do they know this in Sacramento? They have these data in a couple articles I wrote. What are the politics of leaving this kind of a model in place, and indeed going around to the federal government and saying, we've got a better growth model than yours, let's use ours? It's out of my league. I can't tell you, but check out the numbers. They're pretty hard to argue with. I don't have a conclusion. That's it.